With me now is Johnathan Panikoff, Director of the Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Middle East program. He's also a former U.S. intelligence officer. Good morning. Good to see you again.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So I want to begin by getting your takeaway from the UN emergency session yesterday. Many concerns were brought forward. Do you think that it will change anything?
I think, unfortunately, it's unlikely. Look, the reality is we've seen a lot of diplomatic efforts, both at the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, and now even bilaterally, the diplomatic decisions by Australia, the UK, Canada, of course, to recognize Palestine. And it's unlikely, frankly, to move the needle. The Netanyahu government and Prime Minister Netanyahu himself is very clear that he thinks the war actually needs to be expanded into Gaza City. I think the best that we can hope for right now is that between the time that the announcement was made last week and when it might actually start, there are rumors of somewhere between a couple of weeks in October. Maybe the U.S. can use that time, along with Qatar in Egypt, to get Hamas back to the table and to get to an actual permanent ceasefire.
Well, to that point, are talks still ongoing?
They are behind the scenes. So you have had Qatari intermediaries that have reached out to Hamas. You have had Egyptian as well. And Steve Witkoff, the U.S. negotiator, has been going back and forth. He's been a little tied up now with a bit of a different issue, frankly, on Russia-Ukraine. Exactly right. It's a lot of responsibility for any one individual to have. But there are talks still ongoing. The question is, can they become formalized? Can you get the Israelis back to the table, and can you get Hamas back to the table? The problem is, for those on the ground in Gaza, the Hamas leadership in Gaza that's remaining, it's long been split from the Hamas leadership that's outside, in Qatar, for instance. And it's not quite clear, frankly, that the Hamas leadership in Gaza sees what's happening as a negative. I think they view the starvation, the increasing calls for international recognition of Palestine to actually be a positive, that they have to compromise less now. And so it's creating a really challenging situation for the intermediaries.
Why do you think that Netanyahu is so convinced or so dead set on moving into Gaza City, saying, you know, I'm going to slough off the international condemnation, I'm going to ignore that, go in because this is the only way to end the war and root out Hamas once and for all?
There's two ways to think about this. Look, from a policy perspective, he believes, wrongly I would argue, that you have to literally take out every single Hamas fighter. I don't think that's possible. I think more importantly, we've seen from Israeli military leadership a number of senior officials come out and say that's just not possible. That's just not how this works. Israel has already, frankly, completed all of its strategic military goals that it had. There's some tactical ones left, but all of Hamas leadership has largely been destroyed. The tunnels largely collapsed. You can have a discussion about Israel staying on the border with the Egyptians, the Rafah crossing. The reality is that Netanyahu doesn't believe that. He thinks it all has to be taken out. The flip side of the corollary to that, though, of course, is the politics of this. He's really trapped by a far right-wing coalition of ultranationalists who are using the policy to advance political aims, which is fundamentally to resettle Gaza with Israelis. And then Netanyahu himself is trapped by what has been a long-going legal saga in which he needs Israeli ultranationalists to provide support for the coalition so that it doesn't fall. And of course, those ultranationalists are the same ones pushing for resettlement in Gaza. And so you have a policy objective that he really might believe, but I think there's a lot of politics driving this. I don't think that was as true, frankly, 9-10 months ago. But since we've seen the completion of major strategic military objectives, it's getting harder and harder not to believe that that's, frankly, the driving factors here.
Johnathan Panikoff is the director of the Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Middle East program. He's also a former U.S. intelligence officer. Thank you so much.